The morning sun illuminated the congested streets of the big city, reflecting off the glass of buildings and creating an illusion of calm that contrasted with the frantic rhythm of urban life. Don Edward adjusted the simple coat he wore, very different from the elegant attire he usually wore in his penthouse or at the headquarters of his transportation company. Today he wasn't the powerful businessman who commanded a fleet of hundreds of buses. He was just another anonymous passenger, with carefully disheveled grey hair and ordinary glasses that disguised his penetrating eyes, accustomed to evaluating financial statements. The wrinkles on his tanned face deepened when he furrowed his brow, critically observing every detail around him. I need to see with my own eyes how the service I offer is doing. Reports can show numbers, but the real experience of passengers is worth more than 1,000 graphs, he thought to himself, while waiting in line to board one of his own company's buses. The vehicle arrived 15 minutes late, something Don Edward mentally noted with disapproval. The door opened with a creak that shouldn't exist in a well-maintained transport, and the disguised businessman climbed the steps with the agility his 60 years allowed. The interior of the bus was crowded, as was to be expected during rush hour, with passengers pressed against each other, holding on wherever they could. The air was dense and suffocating, a mixture of cheap perfumes, sweat, and the characteristic odor of upholstery worn by constant use. Don Edward found a standing spot near the window, holding on to one of the vertical bars as the vehicle started abruptly, causing several passengers to lose their balance. "This is unacceptable," he muttered to himself, observing the driver who was driving recklessly. "My employees are putting lives at risk every day, and I never knew." The bus advanced through congested avenues, stopping and accelerating with abrupt movements that tested everyone's balance on board. Don Edward observed everything with critical eyes: the torn seats, the burned-out lights, the poorly cleaned windows. Each detail was a flaw that would never have been reported in weekly meetings with his managers. His body swayed with the movement of the vehicle, while his mind quickly calculated the cost of a complete fleet renovation. It was evident that his quality guidelines were not being followed, and this infuriated him internally, even though he maintained a neutral expression, typical of a common passenger who was already accustomed to those precarious conditions. Beside him, people of all ages were squeezed together, resigned to the inadequate service, as if they didn't deserve something better. All these years believing I offered a quality service. What shame I feel seeing the reality my passengers face daily, he reflected, feeling a pang of guilt that intensified with each jolt. In one of the seats near the rear door, a small figure caught Don Edward's attention. It was a girl of approximately 8 years old, with black hair tied in 2 braids and large, attentive eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. She wore simple but clean clothes and firmly held a small, colorful backpack on her lap. Unlike the tired and bored expressions of adults, the girl observed everything with genuine curiosity, as if each trip were an adventure. Her small feet barely touched the floor of the bus, and she swung her legs to the rhythm of the road's irregularities. Don Edward couldn't help but smile when he saw how she seemed to quietly talk to a rag doll worn by use, sharing secrets and observations about the other passengers. "Look, Carmela," the girl whispered to her doll. "That gentleman with grey hair looks sad and tired. Can we do something to cheer him up?" The bus continued its route through increasingly busy streets, while the heat inside the vehicle increased. Don Edward began to feel a strange pressure in his chest, something he initially attributed to the heat and indignation at the state of his buses. He breathed deeply, trying to ignore the discomfort, and concentrated on the mental notes he made for the emergency meeting he would call as soon as he returned to the office. Each observed problem would be addressed and solved. He would personally guarantee it. Sweat began to drip down his forehead, and he passed a handkerchief over his face, noticing how his vision seemed slightly blurred at the edges. He attributed the discomfort to the suffocating heat and poor ventilation of the vehicle, another item for his growing list of problems to solve. "Just a few more stops," he said to himself, distressed. "I need to endure to see the complete route. I cannot fail my passengers again." When the bus made a particularly sharp turn, the pressure in Don Edward's chest suddenly intensified, transforming into a sharp, crushing pain that radiated to his left arm. His breathing became labored and shallow, while drops of cold sweat ran down his pale face. He tried to hold on more tightly to the support bar, but his fingers seemed unresponsive. His vision began to darken at the edges, like an old photograph gradually fading. With tremendous effort, he tried to ask for help, but his voice came out as a hoarse whisper that was lost in the noise of the engine and conversations around him. He felt his knees give way, and before he could do anything, his heavy body slid to the floor of the bus with a dull thud. "Please, help," were his last conscious words before darkness enveloped him completely. Don Edward's collapse generated a strange reaction in the crowded bus. Instead of the expected movement of solidarity, there was a collective withdrawal, as if the fallen man were carrying some contagious disease. The closest passengers took a step back, looking at the unconscious man on the floor with a mixture of apprehension and indifference. Some murmured among themselves, others pretended not to see, absorbed in their phones or staring fixedly out the window. Nobody took the initiative to provide assistance, as if the accelerated rhythm of urban life had eliminated any trace of empathy. The driver, noticing the commotion through the rearview mirror, merely shouted without turning around, asking what was happening, but without stopping the vehicle or taking any immediate action. "Someone call an ambulance! This man needs help now," shouted an elderly lady, but nobody moved to attend to her request, all trapped in an inexplicable inertia. It was at this moment that little Ellie, the girl with braids whom Don Edward had noticed earlier, got down from her seat with determination. Making her way between the legs of adults paralyzed by indifference, she approached the fallen man with surprising confidence for someone so young. Her dark eyes quickly assessed the situation, and without hesitation, she placed her backpack on the floor and knelt beside Don Edward. With precise gestures, she checked if he was breathing, positioning her face close to the man's nose as she had learned during the long months caring for her sick grandmother. Then gently, she loosened Don Edward's tie and collar and positioned his head slightly tilted to the side, ensuring that his airways were unobstructed, exactly as the nurse had taught her. "My grandmother has attacks like this sometimes," she explained in a firm voice to the adults around her, who now watched with amazement as the little girl took control of the situation. "He needs space to breathe, and we need to call an ambulance immediately." Ellie's example seemed to break the spell of indifference that kept everyone paralyzed. A young student quickly pulled out his phone to call an ambulance, while a lady offered water, and another passenger his folded coat to support Don Edward's head. The little girl remained beside the man, constantly checking his breathing and keeping his head in the correct position. Her small hands, accustomed to helping in her grandmother's recovery, now worked with surprising precision, checking the pulse in Don Edward's neck, something she had observed doctors do countless times. The driver finally stopped the bus and approached, visibly nervous and unprepared to handle the emergency, but willing to follow the guidance of the child who seemed to know exactly what to do. "He's having a heart attack," said Ellie with the confidence of someone who knew the symptoms well. "My grandmother had 3, and the doctor always said that every minute is important." The ambulance arrived after what seemed like an eternity, but in reality was only 15 minutes. The paramedics boarded the bus with equipment and a stretcher, surprised to find a child performing basic first aid procedures so competently. They quickly took control, checking Don Edward's vital signs and preparing him for transport. Ellie remained nearby, answering the paramedics' questions with impressive clarity, explaining the symptoms she had observed and the measures she had taken. When asked about the patient's personal information, however, she couldn't answer, as she didn't know him. They searched Don Edward's pockets, but found no identification documents. Part of his disguise as an ordinary passenger was not carrying anything that could reveal his true identity. "Can I go with him to the hospital?" asked Ellie with determination. "My grandmother always says that nobody should be alone when they're sick." The paramedics exchanged hesitant glances, but eventually agreed, impressed by the little girl's maturity. The rest of the passengers watched the scene with a mixture of admiration and shame, aware that it had taken a child's initiative to awaken in them the sense of humanity that seemed dormant. While they carried Don Edward into the ambulance, Ellie asked a female passenger to hold her Carmela doll, promising she would come back for it. With determined steps, the girl climbed into the ambulance and sat where they indicated, showing no fear in the face of medical equipment and flashing lights. Her eyes never left Don Edward's pale face, while one paramedic placed an oxygen mask on the businessman and the other prepared the cardiac monitor. "Everything will be all right, sir," she murmured, holding Don Edward's cold hand as the ambulance departed with its siren on. "I'm here with you." The ambulance weaved through the chaotic city traffic, its siren clearing a path among vehicles that reluctantly moved aside. Inside the moving vehicle, the paramedics worked with silent efficiency, connecting Don Edward to monitors and administering medications through a needle inserted in his arm. Ellie observed everything attentively, without showing the fear that would be expected from a child in that situation. On the contrary, her eyes registered each procedure with an almost scientific curiosity, as if she were absorbing knowledge for future emergencies. When one of the paramedics noticed her interest, he briefly explained what he was doing, surprised by the pertinent questions the little girl asked. Don Edward remained unconscious, his face now partially covered by the oxygen mask, and his breathing, previously irregular, began to stabilize thanks to the care received. "Do you want to be a doctor when you grow up?" the paramedic asked Ellie, while checking Don Edward's vital signs again. "You have a lot of talent for it." The public hospital in the city outskirts was an outdated building with peeling walls, endless lines and equipment that worked through sheer persistence. The ambulance parked with a sudden jolt at the emergency doors, where the medical team was already waiting. Ellie got out of the vehicle right after Don Edward's stretcher, her small hurried steps trying to keep up with the accelerated pace of the paramedics as they pushed the unconscious man through the crowded corridors. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the characteristic odor of sickness and medications invaded her nostrils, bringing back memories of the months she had accompanied her grandmother in that same hospital. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently on the ceiling, casting ghostly shadows on the concerned faces of the doctors receiving the new patient. Ellie tried to remain visible without getting in the way, aware that she wasn't really related to that gentleman, but determined not to abandon him when he most needed someone by his side. "Please let me stay with him," Ellie begged a nurse who was hurriedly passing by with a clipboard in her hands. "He has no one. He was alone on the bus when he fell. I promise not to get in the way. I'll stay quiet in a corner." The doctors worked frantically around Don Edward, now transferred to a hospital stretcher. Monitors were connected, orders were shouted in medical jargon, and little Ellie was pushed out of the emergency room by gentle but firm hands. A middle-aged nurse with tired eyes and a comforting smile knelt at her level and explained that they needed space to work, promising that as soon as possible she would allow her to visit the patient. Meanwhile, she asked if they should notify her parents. Ellie bit her lower lip, hesitant. Her mother had been working 2 jobs since they had moved to the city, and during the day, the girl was usually under the care of a neighbor. After seeing the clock on the wall indicating almost noon, Ellie realized she should be in school, not in a hospital accompanying a stranger. Still, something inside her insisted that she needed to stay there. "My mother is working until very late today," she finally responded with a half-truth. "And I promised the gentleman I wouldn't leave him alone. He held my hand in the ambulance, even unconscious. I think he knew I was there, and it helped him." The following hours transformed into a blur of anxious waiting, with Ellie sitting on a hard plastic bench in the corridor, observing the coming and going of doctors and nurses. Eventually, Don Edward was transferred to the intensive care unit, and little Ellie, through a combination of sincere pleas and the compassion of the hospital staff, managed to get permission to visit him briefly. The sight of the once imposing man, now connected to tubes and machines that beeped in a constant rhythm, made her heart tighten. His face was pale as paper, contrasting drastically with his grey hair and the deep lines that marked his expression, even at rest. The hands that once firmly held the bus rail now rested inert on the white hospital sheet. Ellie approached the bed cautiously, as if fearing that the slightest noise could harm the patient's recovery. "Sir, it's me, Ellie. The girl from the bus," she whispered, gently holding Don Edward's hand between her small hands. "The doctor said you had a heart attack, but that you'll get better if you rest a lot. I'm praying for you to get better soon." On the second day, Ellie established a surprisingly orderly routine for a child of her age. She appeared at the hospital just after dawn, bringing with her school backpack and the ragdoll Carmela, which she had recovered from the bus. She sat by Don Edward's bed during the allowed visiting hours, telling him stories in a low voice, describing the weather outside, or simply holding his hand in silence. When she needed to leave for meals or when the nurses insisted that she rest, Ellie would go to the small hospital chapel. There, kneeling before the image of the Virgin, she prayed fervently for the recovery of the unknown man, with the same intensity she had prayed for her grandmother months before. The hospital staff, initially cautious about the constant presence of the girl, eventually surrendered to her determination and kindness. A nurse occasionally brought her juice or a sandwich. An older doctor stopped to explain the monitors and procedures, impressed with her intelligent questions and genuine interest. "Our Lady, I know I've asked for many things from you this year," Ellie murmured, kneeling in the chapel with her hands joined in fervent prayer. "But please don't let this man die. He seems very important. He must have a family that loves him and needs him, just as I needed my grandmother." The third day brought a slight improvement in Don Edward's condition. The doctors reduced some medications and his vital signs showed greater stability. Ellie noticed these changes even before they were explained to her. Her attentive eyes catching the smallest alterations in the monitors she now knew how to interpret, thanks to the patient explanations of the medical team. That afternoon, she brought a small colored drawing she had made during the night, a simple but touching representation of a standing man smiling under a bright sun with the words, "Get well soon," written in careful childish letters. She carefully placed the drawing on the small table next to the bed, where Don Edward could see it when he woke up. The routine of prayers and one-sided conversations continued, with Ellie sharing details of her life with the unconscious patient. She talked about her hard-working mother, about how they had recently moved to the big city, about her new school, and her dreams of one day becoming a doctor or nurse to help people like him. "You will wake up soon, I know it," Ellie said with conviction as she arranged the drawing so that it would be perfectly visible. "And when you wake up, I'll tell you how I took care of my grandmother when she got sick, and how I learned to recognize when someone is having a heart attack." In the early hours of the fourth day, something extraordinary happened. Ellie had fallen asleep in a chair next to the bed, with special permission from the head nurse of the night shift, who hadn't had the heart to send her away when the girl begged to stay just a little longer. The monitors began to show subtle changes in Don Edward's cardiac and respiratory pattern, indicating a transition from the state of deep unconsciousness to a more natural sleep. His fingers moved slightly, as if seeking something to hold, and found Ellie's small hand which rested near his on the bed. This contact seemed to calm him, and his breathing established a more regular rhythm. Don Edward's eyelids trembled, fighting against the weight of residual sedation, until they finally opened, revealing confused eyes trying to make sense of the strange environment around him. The first thing he saw clearly was the colored drawing on the small table, and soon after, the sleeping girl next to his bed, still holding his hand with innocent confidence. Where am I?" murmured Don Edward with a voice hoarse from disuse, instinctively squeezing the girl's hand. "Who are you, little one? Was it you who made this beautiful drawing?" The sound of the deep voice awakened Ellie instantly. Her sleepy eyes opened in shock and then lit up with pure joy when she realized that Don Edward was awake. With an impulse she couldn't contain, the girl stood up and carefully hugged the man, avoiding the tubes and wires that still connected him to the machines. Tears flowed freely down her small brown face as she repeated, "You woke up. You woke up," like a mantra of gratitude. The night shift nurse, attracted by the commotion, quickly entered the room and, seeing the conscious patient, hurried to call the doctor on duty. The next few minutes were a confusion of medical professionals checking vital signs, asking questions, and expressing surprise at the faster-than-expected recovery. During all this time, Don Edward didn't let go of Ellie's hand, as if that small contact was his anchor to reality, preventing him from sinking back into the darkness of unconsciousness. "You stayed here with me all this time?" asked Don Edward when they were finally relatively alone again, his voice still weak but full of emotion. "A little girl like you, taking care of an unknown old man. You are an angel sent from heaven, you know." The following days marked Don Edward's steady and impressive recovery. Ellie's daily presence seemed to have a therapeutic effect on him, motivating him to put effort into his breathing exercises and to strictly follow medical recommendations. The businessman, accustomed to giving orders and not receiving them, surprisingly obeyed without questioning when Ellie insisted that he take his medications or rest a little longer. A special bond had formed between the powerful transportation magnate and the humble little girl, a connection that transcended social and age barriers, based on the deepest gratitude on one side and the purest compassion on the other. During the long hours together, Don Edward began to share stories from his life, carefully edited to not reveal his true identity. He spoke about his modest childhood, about how he had worked hard to build a better life, about dreams he had achieved and those he still cherished. Ellie listened, fascinated, her big eyes absorbing every word like a thirsty sponge. "When I fully recover," promised Don Edward on a sunny afternoon while watching Ellie draw another of her colorful encouragement cards, "I will find a way to thank you for everything you've done for me. You saved my life twice, first on the bus and then with your prayers and company here at the hospital." On the 10th day, the doctors finally authorized Don Edward's discharge, with a list of recommendations and medications that he should strictly follow at home. The news was received with mixed feelings by the unlikely duo, joy for the recovery, but sadness for the end of that period of intense companionship. That morning, Ellie arrived earlier than usual, bringing a small package wrapped in newspaper, decorated with hand-drawn hearts and stars. Inside was a simple rosary with wooden beads darkened by constant use. It was a memento from her grandmother, she explained shyly, an object of purely sentimental value that she wanted Don Edward to take with him for protection. The businessman, deeply touched by this gesture, tried to refuse the precious gift, but faced with the girl's sincere insistence, he eventually accepted, promising to always keep it with affection and respect. The hour of farewell was approaching, and Don Edward realized that in all those days, he had never asked where Ellie lived or how to contact her. "Ellie, I need to know where to find you after I leave here," said Don Edward, holding the girl's hands in his. "You were my guardian angel, and I want to be able to repay your kindness. Can you tell me where you live or give me a phone number so I can talk to your mother?" The seemingly simple question provoked an unexpected reaction in Ellie. Her smile faltered momentarily, and a brief flash of concern crossed her gaze before she could control it. With surprising poise for a child, she diverted from the subject, saying that her mother was very busy and didn't have a phone, and that they would soon be moving house again. Before Don Edward could insist, a nurse entered the room with the final documents for medical discharge, and in that small moment of distraction, Ellie said goodbye with a tight hug and ran out, saying she needed to go to school. Don Edward stood looking at the door through which she had disappeared, with the strange feeling that the girl was deliberately avoiding giving him contact information. This enigmatic behavior only increased his determination to find her again to properly express his gratitude. "There's something strange about the way she avoided my question," he muttered to himself, clutching the small rosary in his hand. "That child risked everything to save a complete stranger. I need to find her again, whatever it takes." After being discharged, Don Edward returned to his mansion on the outskirts of the city, where his staff awaited him with concern. In the 10 days he had been missing, his company had been turned upside down in desperate searches, and the police were already involved in the case. His arrival in a common taxi, weakened but alive, caused commotion among the employees who treated him not just as a boss, but as a father figure. Don Edward briefly explained what had happened, emphasizing little Ellie's courage, and admitting that he had been disguised on one of his own buses. After resting for a few hours, he summoned his personal assistant and the company's head of security. With a firm voice that admitted no contestation, he ordered them to mobilize all necessary resources to find a girl named Ellie, approximately 8 years old, who frequented the public hospital in the periphery. He described her meticulously: the black braids, the large expressive eyes, the cloth doll named Carmela, the colorful backpack. He also mentioned the few details he had managed to collect about her life: the mother who worked a lot, the sick grandmother, the recent move to the city. "I will spare no effort to find this girl," declared Don Edward, pounding his fist on the desk in his luxurious office. "She saved my life without asking for anything in return, without knowing who I was or how much money I have. We need to find her so I can repay at least a fraction of what she did for me." The search for Ellie proved more challenging than Don Edward had initially imagined. At the hospital, information was scarce. The girl had never provided a surname or complete address, only vaguely mentioned a neighborhood in the eastern part of the city. The staff remembered her fondly, but nobody knew how to find her. The investigation advanced to schools in the mentioned region, but none had recent records of a transferred student matching that description. Weeks passed, and Don Edwards' frustration grew proportionally to his determination. During this period, he implemented radical changes in his transport company. Inspired by the experience he had lived, fleet renewal, better conditions for employees, first aid training for all drivers. Each measure was taken with Ellie in mind, as if each improved bus, each life potentially saved by the new training, was a silent tribute to the girl who had transformed his worldview. She can't have simply disappeared, Don Edward insisted in daily meetings with his search team. A child with so much compassion and intelligence leaves marks wherever she goes. Continue searching, expand the search area, offer a reward if necessary, but find her. Finally, after almost a month of fruitless searches, a promising lead emerged. A nurse at the hospital remembered hearing Ellie mention a specific street when talking to another child in the waiting room. With this information, Don Edwards' team concentrated their efforts on the indicated place, a humble area in the extreme periphery of the city with simple houses and dirt roads. After questioning local residents, they found an elderly lady who recognized the description of Ellie and her mother. According to her, the two had lived in a small rented house at the end of the main street, but had suddenly moved about 2 weeks ago without telling anyone or leaving a contact address. The news that he had missed Ellie by such a short time hit Don Edward like a physical blow, but his determination remained unshakable. That same afternoon, he personally drove to the indicated address, dismissing his driver and security guards. He wanted to face this journey alone. She was here so recently, he said to himself as he parked in front of the modest and apparently abandoned house. I feel I'm getting closer to finding her, and nothing will stop me from thanking my guardian angel. The house where Ellie had lived was a simple construction of exposed bricks and zinc roof, with a small porch in front and a backyard where some forgotten clothes still swayed on the clothesline. The door was merely ajar, as if the last occupants had left in a hurry without worrying about properly locking it. Don Edward hesitated momentarily, aware that he was trespassing, but his need to find any clue about Ellie's whereabouts overcame his reservations. He gently pushed the door, which opened with a protesting creak. The interior was practically empty, confirming that the residents had moved out. Some broken furniture or pieces too large to be transported remained as silent witnesses to lives that had once flourished there. Don Edward walked slowly through the small but clean rooms, imagining Ellie playing there, doing her homework, helping her mother with household chores. In what appeared to have been the girl's bedroom, he found a crumpled sheet of paper with a colored drawing, similar to those she made at the hospital. A house, a woman, and a girl holding hands, with a smiling sun in the sky. "Where did you go, little Ellie?" whispered Don Edward, carefully tucking the drawing into his pocket. "Why did your family disappear so suddenly? Is there something you're afraid of?" When he was about to give up and leave, something caught his attention in the main room. On a dusty shelf forgotten in the corner, there was a wooden frame turned face down, as if it had been knocked over in the rush of moving. Don Edward approached and picked up the object carefully, turning it to see the photograph it contained. What he saw made his heart stop for a moment, and his knees weakened to the point of needing to lean against the nearest wall. The photograph showed a young and beautiful woman, with the same large, expressive eyes as Ellie, smiling shyly at the camera. It was a face that Don Edward knew deeply, a face he could never forget, even after all these years of separation. It was Mary, his great and only true love, the woman who had suddenly disappeared from his life years ago, taking with her all the dreams and plans they had built together. And beside her in the photograph, much smaller but unmistakable, was an Ellie of about 3 years old with the same braids and the same smile that had captivated Don Edward at the hospital. "My God," murmured Don Edward with a voice choked with emotion, his hands trembling as he held the photograph. Ellie is my daughter. Mary had my child and never told me." Don Edward remained motionless, his fingers trembling while holding the framed photograph. The dim light entering through the dirty windows of the abandoned house illuminated Mary's face in the image, highlighting that smile he knew so well which had been his son for so many years. Next to her, little Ellie, still a toddler, with the same expressive eyes that had stared at him with such determination on the bus and later at the hospital. The resemblance was undeniable now that he saw it clearly. The same face shape, the same slightly stubborn chin, even the way of tilting her head was identical to Mary's. How had he not noticed before? How had he not seen the features of his own face mixed with Mary's in that brave girl who had saved his life? Don Edward slowly sank to the floor, sitting on the dusty floor, unable to look away from the photograph that seemed to burn in his hands. Years had passed since Mary had disappeared from his life, without an explanation, without a proper goodbye, just a brief letter saying she needed to follow her own path. Mary, why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide our daughter from me all these years? He whispered to the silent image, as if he could extract answers from the photographic paper. What right did you have to deprive me of knowing and loving Ellie? Don Edward's mind wandered through the past, reopening carefully archived memories, looking for signs he might have missed, indications that Mary was expecting his daughter when she left. They had met when Don Edward was still building his transportation empire, when he still worked 18 hours a day to transform his small initial fleet into a respectable company. Mary was a secretary in one of the offices where he sought financing, and her sincere smile had immediately captured his attention amid the coldness of numbers and contracts. They began dating discreetly, as the relationship between a client and an employee was not well regarded. For 2 years they lived an intense love, but always in the shadow of Don Edward's professional ambitions. He now remembered with painful clarity the arguments they had about his impossible schedules, about the little time he devoted to the relationship, about how work always came first. But he also remembered the promises he had made, that one day when the company was established, they would have time to build a life together, a family. I was so obsessed with building an empire, with proving my worth to the world. I was so blind, so stupid, he exclaimed, hitting his fist against the dusty floor. While I was chasing after wealth to offer to you and our future children, I lost the true treasure that was already within my reach. With difficulty, Don Edward rose from the floor, still clutching the photograph as if it were a precious talisman. He walked slowly through the rest of the house, looking for more clues, more fragments of Mary and Ellie's life that might help him understand what had happened, to discover where they had gone. In the room he presumed had belonged to Ellie, he found a small collection of seashells carefully arranged on the windowsill. In the larger bedroom, a scarf forgotten under the bed, with Mary's perfume still faintly present, bringing a wave of memories so vivid they nearly knocked him down again. In the small kitchen, a calendar pinned to the wall showed a red circle on a date from the previous month, some important appointment that might have precipitated their sudden departure. Don Edward collected each object as if they were pieces of a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. At the bottom of a kitchen drawer, he found a crumpled envelope containing the most recent electricity bill, with Mary's full name and an identification number that could be used to track her. I will find them, no matter how long it takes, no matter the cost, Don Edward promised himself, carefully tucking the envelope into his pocket. Years were stolen from me as a father, but I won't lose one more day of my daughter's life. With the photograph and the few objects he'd found carefully stored away, Don Edward left the abandoned house and returned to his car. Sitting there, with the engine off, he tried to organize his tumultuous thoughts and establish a plan of action. The initial shock of discovering he had a daughter and that this daughter was precisely the girl who had saved him was slowly giving way to a burning determination to find them and understand the whole truth. He couldn't hate Mary, despite what she had done. Something in his heart insisted that she must have had powerful reasons to hide Ellie from him. The Mary he had known and loved wasn't a cruel or vindictive person. She had a deep sense of justice and compassion. If she had hidden his daughter from him all these years, she must have sincerely believed she was doing what was best for the child. Don Edward took out his phone and called his personal assistant, giving precise instructions to hire the best private investigators to mobilize all his company's resources in the search for Mary and Ellie. I want them to use the full name and identification number on this bill to track all her possible whereabouts in recent times, he ordered with a firm voice that barely disguised his emotion. I want to know where they worked, where they lived, who their friends were, everything, and I need this information as quickly as possible." In the days that followed, Don Edward immersed himself with obsessive intensity in the investigation of Mary and Ellie's past. The office in his mansion transformed into a search headquarters, with maps on the walls marking places where they had possibly been, detailed timelines of their known movements, photographs and documents carefully organized in chronological order. The man who had been a rigorous and focused businessman became even more meticulous in this new personal mission. He slept only a few hours a night, spending most of his time analyzing reports, interviewing people who might have had contact with Mary, reviewing security camera footage from places where they had possibly been seen. The investigators he had hired regularly brought new information, pieces of the puzzle that slowly began to form a coherent picture of Mary and Ellie's life. He discovered they had moved at least 7 times during this period, always living modestly, always seeming to be one step ahead of something or someone. Why so much caution, Mary? Who or what were you running from all these years? Don Edward murmured as he traced with his finger the route from city to city that they had traveled. Were you running from me? Were you afraid I would take Ellie away from you? Or was there some other danger I never knew about? The big discovery came through a former colleague of Mary's, located in a town hundreds of miles away. The woman was initially reluctant to speak, clearly protective of her friend's secrets, but when Don Edward begged, explaining that he just wanted to understand why he had been kept away from his daughter for so many years, she finally yielded. According to her account, Mary had discovered her pregnancy a few weeks before disappearing from Don Edward's life. Initially happy and eager to tell him, she began to doubt whether he would really give the child the attention and love it deserved. At that time, Don Edward was negotiating the biggest acquisition of his career, working practically without sleep, completely consumed by the ambition to expand his company. Mary had tried several times to talk to him about future plans, about family, testing the ground to announce her pregnancy, but he always diverted the conversation back to his professional projects, to after everything was resolved. The final blow came when she accidentally overheard a conversation between Don Edward and a partner, in which he categorically stated that children would have to wait at least 5 more years, that he had no time or patience for children at this point in his life. My God, did I say that? Did I really say something so terrible, so thoughtless? Don Edward buried his face in his hands, vaguely remembering the conversation, the context in which those unfortunate words had been spoken. I never imagined Mary might be listening, never dreamed she was already carrying our daughter. How much harm I caused without even knowing. More details emerged through other people who had crossed Mary and Ellie's path over the years. One of Ellie's teachers from 3 years ago remembered how Mary always seemed tense during school meetings, especially when the subject was the girl's absent father. A doctor who had treated Ellie during a serious fever recalled Mary crying in the hospital corridor, saying that he should be here, should know the wonderful daughter he has. Each new account was like a knife to Don Edward's heart, revealing the suffering his ignorance had caused in the 2 most important lives he had ever touched. But there were also comforting stories, of how Mary always told Ellie that her father was a good and hard-working man, of how she kept newspaper clippings about Don Edward's business successes, of how she never allowed the girl to develop resentment toward the father she didn't know. "She didn't hate me," whispered Don Edward with a choked voice, holding one of these clippings found among the belongings left behind. "Despite everything, she maintained my positive image for our daughter. Mary, always so generous, so fair, even when she had every reason to hate me." The investigation took a more promising turn when they discovered records of a bus ticket purchased in Mary's name, bound for a small coastal town about 500 kilometers away. It was a recent lead from just 2 weeks ago, coinciding with the date marked on the calendar, found in the abandoned house. Don Edward immediately ordered that all efforts be concentrated in that direction. New investigators were sent to the town, discreet but efficient, with the mission to locate mother and daughter without approaching them directly. He didn't want to frighten them, didn't want them to flee again before he had a chance to explain, to beg for forgiveness, to try to make up for years of involuntary absence. While waiting for news, Don Edward continued compiling everything he had discovered about his daughter's life. Her always exemplary school grades, her talent for drawing, her dream of becoming a doctor someday, her natural kindness toward people in need, the same kindness that had saved him on the bus. How could I miss all of this? The first steps, the first words, the baby teeth falling out, the night fevers, the bedtime stories. His voice failed as he enumerated all the precious moments he would never recover. But I won't miss anything else. Not a smile, not a tear. I'll be the father Ellie deserves, even if I have to start from zero. Finally, after 10 days of intense searching in the coastal town, confirmation came. Mary and Ellie had been located. They lived in a simple but cozy house near the beach, where Mary worked as an accountant at a small hotel, and Ellie attended the local school. According to the investigators, they seemed to have settled recently, still unpacking boxes and getting to know the neighborhood. The report included current photographs of the two. Mary, still beautiful despite the marks of time and difficulties, with premature silver strands mixed with her dark hair. Kelly, grown a few centimeters since the hospital, playing in the beach sand with other children, her smile lighting up her face exactly like her mother's. Don Edward spent hours contemplating these images, his heart divided between joy at having found them and anxiety about how he would be received, about what he would say, about how he could explain that he would never have rejected his daughter if he had known of her existence. What if she doesn't accept me as her father? What if Mary hates me for what happened, he asked himself, anguished. No, I can't think like that. I have to believe there's space for me in their lives. I have to believe it's not too late for us to be a family. The decision to go meet them in person wasn't easy. His advisors suggested more cautious approaches, first a letter, then perhaps a phone call, gradually preparing the ground for a face-to-face meeting. But Don Edward, after so many lost years, couldn't bear the idea of more delays. He packed a simple suitcase, took his personal car instead of the chauffeur-driven limousine he normally used, and set off alone for the coastal town. During the long journey, he mentally rehearsed what he would say, how he would explain, how he would ask forgiveness for something he didn't even know he had done. The hours of travel seemed endless, each mile bringing him closer to the moment that would completely change his life, for better or worse. When he finally reached the town, it was already late afternoon. Following the precise instructions he had received, he parked a few blocks away from Mary's house and walked the rest of the way, his heart beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from his chest. "These years of separation end today," he murmured, as he visualized the simple house at the end of the street, with colorful curtains in the windows and a small garden in front. "Whatever God wills, but I will not live another day without trying to be part of my daughter's life." Standing in front of the house, with the setting sun coloring the sky in shades of orange and pink, Don Edward felt the full weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future. The lights were already on inside, and through the living room window he could see silhouettes moving, his family so close and yet so distant. He took a deep breath, trying to gather courage to take the final steps and knock on the door. In that solemn moment, he took from his pocket the small wooden rosary that Ellie had given him in the hospital, squeezing it between his fingers, as if seeking strength in the same prayers his daughter had made for him when he was between life and death. The sounds of childish laughter coming from inside the house pierced his heart like arrows. Ellie's laughter, a sound that should have been part of his daily life all these years. With one last deep sigh, he put the rosary back in his pocket, adjusted his graying hair with trembling fingers, and walked determinedly to the front door. "I'm ready to face my past and fight for my future," he stated in a quiet but resolute voice, as he raised his hand to knock on the door. "Mary, Ellie, I hope you can forgive me." The sky, previously clear, darkened rapidly as Don Edward approached the small seaside house. Heavy clouds advanced from the horizon, bringing with them the harbinger of a storm that seemed to mirror the turbulence in his heart. The first drops began to fall, thick and heavy, dotting his shirt and forming dark circles on the dirt path that led to the modest residence. Don Edward hesitated for a moment, protecting the photograph he carried inside his jacket. It was the same image he had found in the abandoned house, now carefully framed again, a tangible symbol of the lost years and the hope for redemption. The house before him was simple but welcoming, painted in a soft shade of blue that stood out against the coastal landscape. White curtains danced in the open windows, propelled by the sea breeze that now carried the distinctive smell of imminent rain. A small garden, carefully maintained with colorful flowers and succulent plants, adorned the entrance. It was a modest home, very different from the luxurious mansion where he resided, but it emanated a feeling of warmth that his own palace of marble and crystal had never managed to capture. "After searching for so long, I finally found you," Don Edward murmured to himself, as the raindrops intensified, soaking his graying hair. "My heart tells me this moment will change our lives forever, if I have the courage to knock on that door." With hesitant but determined steps, Don Edward advanced along the path that was now turning to mud beneath his expensive shoes. The rain increased in intensity with each second, as if the sky had chosen this moment to fully open its floodgates. Lightning illuminated the darkened sky, followed by the distant rumble of thunder that seemed to announce the gravity of the moment that was about to happen. When he finally reached the door, he was completely soaked, his elegant suit now heavy and clinging to his body, his grey hair dripping over his face, marked by time and worries. The drops running down his face could easily be confused with tears, and perhaps some really were. Don Edward breathed deeply, trying to calm his racing heart. All this time of separation, years of a daughter growing up without knowing her father, a woman raising a child alone, all of this weighed on him as he raised his hand, forming a trembling fist to knock on the wooden door worn by sea salt. So many times I rehearsed this moment, so many carefully planned words, he thought, feeling his throat tighten with emotion. But now that I'm here, I don't know if I'll be able to utter a single sentence without my voice completely failing. Before he could knock, the door suddenly opened, as if the person on the other side had sensed his presence. And there she was, Mary, as beautiful as in his most precious memories, despite the fine lines that now marked the corners of her eyes and the silver strands that mixed with her black hair. She held a laundry basket in her arms, apparently about to collect items from the clothesline before the storm completely soaked them. Her eyes, those same deep eyes he had seen reflected in Ellie, widened in absolute shock upon recognizing him. The basket slipped from her hands, falling with a dull thud on the wooden floor, scattering folded clothes at her feet. For an endless moment they just looked at each other, paralyzed by time and circumstances, by the rain falling mercilessly, and by the years they had spent apart. The world around seemed to have gone silent. Even the sound of the storm had become a distant and irrelevant noise in the face of the intensity of that reunion. "Edward? Is it really you?" Mary finally broke the silence, her voice oscillating between disbelief and fear, her hands instinctively rising to cover her trembling mouth. How did you find us after so many years?" The soaked man remained motionless for a moment, Mary's voice awakening a whirlwind of emotions that threatened to tear down the barriers carefully built over the years. When he finally managed to speak, his voice came out hoarse and choked, each word carrying the weight of 15 years of involuntary absence. "Mary, I know about Ellie," he said simply, words that contained universes of meaning between them. "I know she's my daughter. I know you left because you thought I wasn't ready to be a father. And I've come to tell you that you were right back then, but now I'm here begging for the chance to meet our daughter, to be part of her life, even if it's too late to recover the lost years." Mary's face visibly paled, her body taking an almost imperceptible step back, as if she had been physically struck by his words. Her eyes, always so expressive, revealed a complex mixture of emotions: surprise, fear, perhaps a glimpse of relief for a secret finally revealed. The rain continued to fall mercilessly, creating a liquid curtain between them, symbolizing the years and secrets that had kept them apart. Mary seemed to struggle internally, her lips moving without emitting sound, as if rehearsing explanations or apologies. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she stepped aside, making way for him to enter, a simple gesture that carried the weight of a mountain of difficult decisions. "Come in, Edward. We can't have this conversation with you soaked at my door," she said with a firmer voice, a spark of the determined Mary he had known momentarily emerging. "But I need to understand how you found out, and why you appear now, after all these years. It's not fair to simply show up like this in our lives. The small living room where Mary led him was cozy and organized, decorated with simple but tasteful furniture. Photographs of Ellie at different ages adorned the walls and shelves, a visual record of all the precious moments he had missed. Don Edward couldn't take his eyes off these images, absorbing every detail with a voracious hunger. Mary observed his reaction in silence, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. The rain battered the windows, creating a background melody for the tense moment. After offering a towel for him to dry himself, Mary sat at the opposite end of the couch, keeping the greatest possible distance between them. "I found her at the hospital," Don Edward began, his voice gaining firmness as the story unfolded. "Ellie saved my life, Mary. I suffered a heart attack on a bus, and it was your daughter, our daughter, who provided first aid, who stayed by my side day and night praying for my recovery. She had no idea who I was, and I had no idea who she was. Isn't it incredible how destiny works? That our daughter saved the father she never knew?" Mary listened to the story with growing astonishment, her initial defenses yielding as Don Edward related the providential encounter with Ellie. Silent tears streamed down his face as he described how the girl had remained by his hospital bed. Don Edward explained how, after recovering, he desperately searched for the girl, finding the abandoned house where the photograph revealed the truth about Ellie. When he finished, a heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the rain and distant thunder. "I always knew that one day you would find out. I lived in fear of this moment," Mary confessed, her voice almost a whisper. "I never imagined it would be Ellie who would find you." Mary then explained why she had left so abruptly. She told how she discovered her pregnancy when Don Edward was completely absorbed in expanding his company. She described the devastation of accidentally overhearing him state that he had no time for children in the coming years. She recalled the fear she felt, a young pregnant woman terrified at the possibility of raising a child in an environment where she would be considered an obstacle to her father's ambition. "You were a man obsessed with success at that time, Edward. You lived for your company, for your business," said Mary, her gaze fixed on her own hands that twisted nervously in her lap. "I loved you deeply, but I couldn't risk our daughter growing up feeling like a burden to her own father. I preferred that she didn't know you rather than see her suffer with an absent father who considered her an obstacle to his dreams." Don Edward absorbed each word like a physical blow, painfully recognizing the truth behind them. He clearly remembered the man he had been, ambitious, obsessed, determined to prove his worth through financial success, placing business above personal relationships. If he were completely honest with himself, he couldn't guarantee that he would have received the news of the pregnancy with joy at that specific moment in his life. The bitter irony was that he had built his empire with the justification of providing security for a future family, only to discover that he had sacrificed that same family in the process. The tears that now freely ran down his face were not just of sadness for the lost years, but of recognition for his own guilt in the situation, albeit unintentional. "You were right about the man I was then, Mary," he admitted with a choked voice, not trying to hide the emotion. "But that man no longer exists. The heart attack, the time in the hospital, discovering about Ellie, all of this completely transformed me. I realized that I built an empty empire, that all my wealth means nothing without people to share it with, without the love that I let slip through my fingers when I was too busy counting money." The palpable sincerity in Don Edward's words seemed to deeply affect Mary. For the first time since he arrived, the tension in her shoulders slightly decreased and her gaze softened. Years of accumulated resentment wouldn't disappear in an instant, but it was evident that a connection still existed between them, a fragile bridge over the abyss of lost years. Mary slowly stood up and walked to one of the photographs on the wall. Ellie, at approximately 5 years old, proudly holding a colorful drawing. Her fingers gently touched the image as if caressing her daughter's face through the glass and time. "I never spoke ill of you to her, you know." Mary turned to face him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I always said that her father was a good man, hard-working, who might one day meet her. I kept newspaper clippings about your successes, showed them to her occasionally, said, 'See how smart your father is.' Perhaps I was preparing for this moment, even without admitting it to myself." The revelation that Mary had kept his memory alive for Ellie was like a balm to Don Edward's wounded soul. It was more than he deserved, considering how his actions had forced Mary to raise a daughter alone. He approached cautiously, as if fearing that any sudden movement might make her disappear again. When he was just a step away, he took from his pocket the small wooden rosary that Ellie had given him at the hospital. "She gave me this when I was discharged," he explained in a soft voice. "Mary, our daughter, has such a generous heart. You did an extraordinary job raising her alone." Mary immediately recognized the rosary. It was a memento from her own mother, something she had passed to Ellie as a symbol of family protection. The storm outside seemed to be gradually diminishing, as if reflecting the softening of the emotional storm inside the house. "She asked about you last week, you know," Mary commented almost casually, carefully observing Don Edward's reaction. "She said she dreamed of a father who had your smile." It was the first time in years that she mentioned the subject so directly, almost as if he sensed that something was about to happen. The mention that Ellie had thought of him, even without knowing who he really was, filled Don Edward's heart with an almost indescribable emotion, a mixture of hope, joy, and the deepest paternal longing. He was about to respond when a sound at the entrance of the room caught both their attention. They turned simultaneously to see Ellie standing in the doorway, wearing a school uniform slightly damp from the rain, her colorful backpack hanging from one shoulder. Her large eyes, so similar to Mary's, were wide with shock and recognition. For a terrible moment, Don Edward feared she would run away, that she would scream, that she would reject him. After all, what was he to her but a stranger suddenly appearing in her home? But then something extraordinary happened. Ellie's face lit up with a smile so radiant, so full of pure and innocent joy that it seemed to illuminate the entire room. "It's you, the man from the bus, the man from the hospital," she exclaimed, letting her backpack fall to the floor with a dull thud. "Mom, it's the man I told you about, the one who was sick and whom I helped. He's well. He found us." Before either adult could react, Ellie ran across the room and threw herself into Don Edward's arms with absolute confidence, as if reuniting with a dear friend after a long separation. The impact almost knocked him over, not from the child's physical force, but from the emotional intensity of the moment. His arms automatically enveloped the small figure, embracing her with all the tenderness accumulated over years of unlived fatherhood. Ellie pulled back slightly to look at him, her face radiant with happiness, completely oblivious to the complexity of the situation the adults in the room were facing. "I prayed so hard for you to get better, and for us to meet again someday. Our Lady answered my prayers," she declared with the simple and unquestionable faith of a child. "Do you still have the rosary I gave you? Did it work? Did it keep you protected?" Perry watched the scene with silent tears streaming down her face, divided between guilt for the years of separation and joy for her daughter's evident happiness. Fate had carved a tortuous and improbable path, uniting father and daughter in the most unexpected way possible. Don Edward looked at Mary over Ellie's head, his eyes begging for permission, for approval, for some sign that he wasn't transgressing boundaries by embracing his own daughter. The slight nod he received in response was like an absolution, a bridge extended over the abyss of years of absence. "Yes, little Ellie, the rosary worked. It kept me safe and guided me to you," responded Don Edward, kneeling to be at the girl's height, his eyes searching in that beloved face for traces of himself, of Mary, of the miraculous fusion that had created this extraordinary being. "And I have something very important to tell you, something that even I didn't know until recently." The rain outside had completely stopped now, and a ray of sunlight managed to penetrate through the clouds, illuminating the room through the window like a divine spotlight on the reunited trio. Don Edward looked again at Mary, seeking guidance on how to proceed. She was his daughter, but Mary had been the one who raised her, who knew her, who understood what she could assimilate and how. The silence between the adults was laden with unformulated questions and momentary decisions that could forever alter the course of 3 lives intertwined by destiny. Ellie looked from one to the other with growing curiosity, intuitively perceiving that something significant was happening, something beyond the simple reunion with the man she had helped. "Mom, why are you crying? Why are you looking at each other like that?" asked Ellie, her insight surprising for someone so young. "Do you know each other? Is Mr. Edward an old friend of yours?" Mary took a deep breath, making a decision she had been postponing for years. She slowly approached, placing herself beside Don Edward, united with him for the first time in more than a decade by the physical presence of their daughter between them. Gently she stroked Ellie's hair, preparing to reveal the truth that could completely transform the girl's life. The setting sunlight now bathed the three in a golden glow, as if the universe itself conspired to bless this moment of reconnection. "Ellie, remember all the stories I told you about your father? About how he was hard-working, intelligent, and how someday you might meet him?" began Mary with a gentle but firm voice, maintaining eye contact with her daughter. "Well, it happens that destiny works in mysterious ways. The man you saved on the bus, the man you prayed for in the hospital, the man who is here now, is your father." Did you like Edward and Mary's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on screen. Click there, and I'll be waiting for you.